The photograph was in a folder marked Archives on the shared drive, buried so deep I would never have found it if Margaret hadn't accidentally left her laptop unlocked during lunch. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally. I was looking for last quarter's revenue reports, the ones I needed to pull for the board presentation that Thomas had somehow managed to assign to me despite my repeated requests to be removed from the project, and there it was. A photo from 1994. Before I even processed what I was looking at, before my brain had time to organize the information my eyes were receiving, I felt something shift in my chest. A coldness that started in my sternum and spread outward like frost on a window, slowly covering everything I thought I knew. The man in the photo was Thomas, unmistakably Thomas, but he was maybe 30 years old in the image. His face unlined and his expression one of pure confidence. He was standing in front of what looked like a corporate office building, his arm around another man's shoulder. That man's face was familiar in a way that made my hands shake. It was Robert Chun, who had been my mentor when I first joined the company. Robert Chun, who had taken me under his wing in 1997 and taught me everything about strategy and market positioning. Robert Chun, who had died in a car accident in 2003, a tragedy that had supposedly devastated Thomas, who'd given a heartfelt eulogy at the funeral that I remembered vividly because I'd cried at it myself. I stared at that photograph for what might have been 5 seconds or might have been 5 minutes. Time does strange things when your reality begins to fracture. I could hear Margaret's voice from down the hallway, laughing at something someone had said. Normal sounds. The normal sounds of a normal Tuesday afternoon at Rothstein and Associates, a company where I had spent the last 28 years of my life. I had turned 52 last month. No one had thrown me a party. No one had acknowledged it except for the automated email from HR that included a link to an employee wellness program I had no interest in using. I closed the folder. My hand moved automatically, my body following protocols my conscious mind wasn't directing. I looked around the empty office. I was alone at this time of afternoon. Most of the younger staff were in the main collaboration space 3 floors below, the ones who preferred open layouts and the constant hum of activity and surveillance disguised as community. I had always preferred the quiet of the private offices, the sense of containment. Now that preference felt like a confession of something, though I couldn't articulate what. 28 years. That's how long I'd been at the company. I'd started in 1997, fresh out of business school with a master's degree and the kind of naive confidence that only comes from having spent most of your life in educational institutions where effort translated to results. I'd built a career here. Not a spectacular career, not the kind that got announced at board meetings or resulted in corner offices on the executive level, but a solid career. I'd weathered 3 recessions, watched the company transform from a mid-sized firm into what was now one of the largest consulting groups in the region, and I'd been part of that transformation. I'd contributed. I'd proven myself. At least I thought I had. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from my ex-wife Rachel. Just checking in. How are you holding up? I didn't respond. Rachel had been checking in on me regularly since the separation 3 years ago, as if my inability to maintain our marriage was a chronic illness requiring ongoing monitoring. We'd been married for 19 years before it collapsed. 2 children, both now in their mid-20s, both seemingly uncomfortable with the fact that their parents could no longer maintain the pretense of compatibility, and a house in the suburbs that Rachel had kept because I'd signed away the rights without really thinking about it. One of those decisions you make when your brain is in autopilot and your emotional system is completely overwhelmed. I minimized the photo folder and pulled up the quarterly reports. They were, predictably, impressive. The company had grown by 18% over the last year. Profitability was up. Client retention was strong. We were, by all measurable metrics, thriving. And yet, sitting there in my office with the afternoon light filtering through the half-closed blinds, I felt like I was looking at a document written in a language I no longer quite understood. The numbers made sense individually. Together, they formed a narrative that increasingly felt fictional to me. I had started to feel this way about 6 months ago, though I hadn't admitted it to anyone, not even Rachel during those periodic check-ins. It began subtly. A project I'd been leading got reassigned to someone half my age. Rebecca Chun, no relation to my former mentor Robert, was 32 and had been with the company for 5 years. She was good. I could acknowledge that even as it bothered me. She was the kind of employee that companies like Rothstein cultivated obsessively. Fresh, ambitious, malleable, and without the accumulated baggage of someone who'd been in one place for nearly 3 decades. When Thomas told me about the reassignment, he did it in a way that was meant to seem like a promotion. He called it a lateral move that would allow me to focus on strategic oversight rather than day-to-day execution. He phrased it as an opportunity. His office was on the 38th floor, all glass and carefully calibrated minimalism, and he gestured toward the city view while he explained that my experience made me perfect for this higher-level positioning. I'd nodded along, and something in my intuition had screamed that this was wrong, that this was the beginning of something, but I'd ignored that screaming. At 52, you learn to ignore a lot of things. You develop the capacity to rationalize, to convince yourself that what's happening is actually what was supposed to happen. By month 2 of the lateral move, I had essentially no projects. I attended meetings where strategic decisions were being made and I was asked my opinion, which I gave, which was then immediately questioned or modified or simply ignored. By month 3, I started noticing that meetings would sometimes happen without me being included in the invite. Meetings about divisions I theoretically had oversight responsibility for. Someone would mention them afterward casually, as if I'd simply been overlooked rather than deliberately excluded, as if it was a simple mistake rather than a pattern. The worst part wasn't even the exclusion. The worst part was the guilt I felt about experiencing the exclusion as a relief. When I wasn't in meetings, I didn't have to pretend to have answers I didn't actually have. I didn't have to justify my existence in a company that seemed to be rapidly deciding that middle-aged consultants were a redundancy rather than an asset. I could sit in my office, read emails, attend the occasional call, and pretend that I was still employed rather than in some form of elaborate dismissal process that hadn't yet reached its conclusion. But now, looking at that photograph of a young Thomas Chun with his arm around Robert Chun's shoulder, Robert, who had taught me everything, who had taken me seriously, who had invested in my development, I understood, with a clarity that made me feel nauseated, that my entire history with the company was being rewritten in real time. I understood that the version of my life I'd been telling myself was false. Not the events had happened, but the meaning I'd assigned to them. The narrative through which I'd been interpreting them had been authored by someone else. I needed to know. Not because I thought it would change anything at 52. With a mortgage I was still paying off and a 401k that was dependent on my continued employment at a company that was clearly trying to force me out. I knew that knowledge wasn't particularly useful, but I needed to know because not knowing was beginning to feel like a form of erasure. Like if I didn't understand what had happened, then nothing I'd accomplished here was real. Then the last 28 years were just a story told by someone else, and I was only a character in it, not the author. I closed my computer and gathered my things. I told Sandra at the reception desk that I was heading home early, that I wasn't feeling well. She barely looked up from her work, which was probably good, because if she'd actually looked at my face, she would have seen something breaking open there, some carefully sealed compartment finally rupturing. I took the elevator down. At this hour 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, the building was still relatively full. I passed people I'd worked with for nearly 30 years, and I didn't speak to any of them. I didn't know if they saw me. I'd been becoming invisible for months, but this was the first moment I was actually conscious of the process. Outside, the fall was doing that thing it does in the city. The leaves were turning, but they were turning gray instead of orange or red. The pollution turned everything muted. I walked for about 6 blocks without thinking about where I was going, and then I found myself standing in front of a coffee shop I didn't remember entering. I ordered an espresso that I didn't want. I sat at a table by the window and tried to organize my thoughts, but they wouldn't organize. They scattered like they were afraid of being assembled into a coherent narrative. What I kept returning to was the simplicity of the thing. A photograph. Evidence that had been sitting in a company folder, completely ordinary, completely visible to anyone who might have been looking for it. Who takes a picture like that and keeps it? Who archives evidence of their past relationships with deceased people? Unless it wasn't meant to be hidden. Unless it was stored in such a way that only someone who was looking for it, who actually opened that particular folder, would find it. Insurance. Thomas was the kind of person who would keep insurance. In 30 years of proximity to someone, you learn things about how they think. You learn their patterns. And one of Thomas's patterns was documentation. He documented everything. I'd always admired this about him, actually. It seemed like the mark of a careful person, someone who took their work seriously enough to maintain records. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Thomas. Subject line, tomorrow's agenda. I opened it without really intending to. The message was brief. Can we touch base before the 9 a.m. meeting? There are some restructuring initiatives we need to discuss. Restructuring initiatives. That phrase had taken on the quality of a euphemism in my experience, like everything in corporate life was a euphemism. Restructuring meant pain. Restructuring meant elimination and displacement and the careful, legal dismantling of people's livelihoods. I didn't respond to the email. I finished the espresso I hadn't wanted and walked back to where I'd parked my car. The drive home took 40 minutes. I had the kind of house that many middle-aged men have: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen that had been renovated in 2008 and was now starting to show its age, a backyard with a deck that I'd promised myself I would stay in for the last 4 years. There was a time, right after the separation, when I thought I would start fresh. I'd considered selling the place and moving into something smaller, something that didn't require so much maintenance, so many rooms to walk through alone. But nothing had come of that impulse. I'd simply stayed. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. My son, Michael, had moved to Denver 2 years ago. He worked for a tech company and seemed perpetually too busy to call. My daughter, Emma, was in graduate school for social work, which she'd chosen, I suspected, partly as a reaction to the fact that our family hadn't actually worked all that well. She called once a month out of a sense of obligation, and we'd have stilted conversations where she'd update me on her life and I'd lie about mine. During our last call, I'd told her that things at work were going great, that there was a big project I was leading. This lie had felt necessary at the time, but now it seemed like just another piece of the fiction I'd been maintaining. I heated up some pasta from the night before and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I pulled up the company directory and found Rebecca Chun's contact information. I didn't call her. Not yet. I just sat there looking at her name, trying to figure out what I actually wanted to know. If I asked her about the project reassignment, would she tell me anything useful? Or would she, correctly, perceive that I was asking her to confirm something that might damage her standing within the company? Instead, I searched my email archives for everything from 1994 through 2005, Robert Chun's emails. There weren't that many. Robert had been in a generation that hadn't immediately adopted email as their primary communication method. Most of his correspondence with me had been face-to-face or over the phone. But there were a few emails from 2000 to 2003 before his death. I opened a few of them, looking for context, for evidence of his relationship with Thomas. They were mostly work-related, project updates, meeting notes. One email from 2002 where Robert mentioned being excited about bringing Thomas along in a certain initiative. "He's got the right instincts," Robert had written. "Sharp. Maybe sharper than the rest of us." That had been Robert's style, generous in his assessment of people, invested in their development. I'd always appreciated that about him. But looking at that email now, through the lens of a photograph I'd seen just hours earlier, it seemed to suggest something else. It seemed to suggest that Robert had recognized something in Thomas, some quality of sharpness that I apparently didn't possess. And if Robert had recognized it, if Robert had chosen to develop Thomas's talent, then perhaps Robert's death hadn't been the accident I'd always believed it to be. Or perhaps it had been, but the timing of it, the way it had happened right as Thomas was on the verge of moving into a position of greater responsibility, seemed, in retrospect, almost convenient. I closed my laptop. That line of thinking was dangerous. I could feel myself starting to construct narratives that were probably false, that were probably just the product of a mind that had spent too long alone in a house that was too quiet. But I couldn't seem to stop. The photograph had opened something up, some possibility that I'd been carefully not acknowledging for months. And now that it was open, I couldn't close it again. Around midnight, I finally went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, thinking about 1994. I'd still been in graduate school then. I'd been applying to jobs. Thomas and Robert had been younger versions of themselves, allies or friends or something that I didn't quite understand. I tried to construct a timeline. How had they met? Had they gone to business school together? I had no idea. These were the kinds of things I'd never thought to ask. When you work with someone for 28 years, you build a narrative about them from fragments, from overheard conversations and casual mentions, and then you stop thinking about the parts that don't quite fit into that narrative. At 3:47 a.m., I got up and went downstairs. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, just thinking. The problem was that I had no proof of anything. A photograph of two men together wasn't proof of conspiracy. People had relationships. They worked together. Sometimes those relationships ended, sometimes because of death, sometimes because of other reasons. There was nothing inherently sinister about any of it. The sinister part was what I was constructing, the story I was starting to tell myself about Thomas and Robert and what might have happened between them. By the time dawn started to break, I had decided not to go to the 9 a.m. meeting. I sent Thomas an email saying I wasn't feeling well. It was technically true, though not in any way that a doctor could have diagnosed or treated. I was sick in the way that only betrayal can make you sick, with a special quality of betrayal that involves the person doing the betraying having no idea that you know about it yet. I spent the morning going through old files. I'd saved a lot of documentation over the years, paper files that I'd kept in the garage, organized in boxes by year. I was looking for anything from the early 2000s that might give me context about Thomas and Robert's relationship. I found performance reviews. I found emails printed out and filed away. I found notes I'd made about projects, about decisions, about my own analysis of the company's trajectory. I found, in a folder labeled Professional Development, a file that contained several printed emails between Robert and myself where we discussed my path at the company, my potential, the ways I could grow into more senior positions. "You have the kind of steadiness that we need," Robert had written in one email from 2001. "You're not flashy, but you're reliable. That's worth more than people think." I'd kept that email because I'd found it affirming at the time. Now I read it again and understood it differently. Steadiness, reliable, not flashy. In the vocabulary of corporate advancement, these were damning words. They meant you weren't ambitious enough, weren't willing to do whatever it took, weren't the kind of person who would rise to the top. They meant you were a middle manager in perpetuity, someone who would stay in the middle because you lacked the kind of ruthlessness that rising required. At around 2 p.m., my phone rang. It was Thomas. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 3 minutes later. This time I answered. "Harrison," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that was meant to convey concern, but actually conveyed something closer to patience, as if he was dealing with someone mildly difficult. "I wanted to check in. You okay?" "Fine," I said. "Just needed a day. Migraines." There was a pause. "Too long. Okay. Well, when you get back, we should talk about some changes that are coming. The board is looking at efficiency improvements, and your position is one of the ones on the table. My position." What did that mean exactly? That my job was insecure? That had been obvious for months, but hearing him say it directly felt different. It felt like a door closing, like we were moving from the phase where the pretense was maintained to the phase where the actual dismantling could begin. "What kind of changes?" I asked, because apparently I still didn't know that I should have just accepted this, that I should have started looking for another job already, that I should have recognized this was over. Nothing definite yet. "But I'd like to discuss it with you tomorrow. Maybe grab lunch? My office afterward?" Lunch, so it wouldn't be in the office where people might see us. It would be at a restaurant, somewhere that could plausibly be a casual meeting if anyone asked. I agreed to meet him at a place we'd been to 100 times before, Marcello's, an Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the office where we'd had countless business meetings and client dinners. After I hung up, I sat there in the garage surrounded by boxes of my history at Rothstein and Associates, and I felt something happen in me. It was small at first, just a shift. A decision. Not the kind of decision you make consciously, but the kind that's already been made by some part of you that's smarter than the conscious part. I was going to find out what was happening. I was going to go back into those files and I was going to figure out what the photograph meant. I was going to ask questions that I already knew might destroy my career, because my career appeared to be destroying itself anyway. And at least if I did it deliberately, at least if I made the choice myself, it would mean something. I spent the rest of the day in a state of focused purpose that I hadn't felt in months. I pulled out my old laptop, one I'd retired from work years ago but had kept in a drawer, and I started doing research. I searched for Thomas's background. I searched for Robert Chun. I searched for the company's history, its leadership changes, its acquisitions and partnerships. What I was looking for was a pattern. What I was looking for was evidence that the narrative I was beginning to construct wasn't just the paranoid fantasy of a man who was about to lose his job. It took me about 3 hours to find something real. There was an article from 2005 published in a local business journal about Robert Chun's death. It had been more than a car accident. It had been a car accident on a dark highway at 2 a.m., and Robert had been found alone in the vehicle. The police report had been filed as accidental, but there was a note in the article mentioning that there were some inconsistencies that made it unclear exactly what had happened. The article had been written shortly after his death, and it had been written more in the style of a human interest piece than an investigative one. "Tragic loss of beloved executive," the headline had said. I read the article multiple times. There was nothing explicitly suspicious about it. But there was an absence, a kind of hole where certain information should have been. Questions that weren't asked, mysteries that weren't pursued. And I realized with a kind of sick certainty that if Robert's death had been anything other than straightforward accidental, it would have been buried. It would have been handled. The company would have had no interest in a scandal, and anyone who might have known anything would have had strong incentives to stay quiet. Around 7 p.m., my phone rang. It was Rachel. "You didn't respond to my text," she said. "I've been busy. Work stuff?" Something like that. There was a pause. Rachel had learned to read silences, or at least she thought she had. "Harrison, you don't sound good." "I'm fine." That's what you always say. And it usually means you're not fine. I considered telling her about the photograph, about the article, about the thing I was starting to believe about Thomas. But I knew that Rachel didn't want to actually hear about my problems. She wanted to perform the role of concerned ex-wife. If I actually told her what was happening, It would move out of the realm of performative concern into something more complicated. She'd feel responsible. She'd try to help. And I didn't want her help. What I wanted was to understand things, and I didn't want anyone else involved in that understanding. "I'm just tired," I said, and we ended the call shortly after. That night, I didn't sleep again. The insomnia was becoming a habit. I would lie in bed and my brain would replay conversations, would extract new meaning from old interactions, would construct scenarios that probably had no basis in reality, but which felt, in the darkness, completely true. I kept seeing that photograph. A young Thomas with his arm around Robert. Robert looking comfortable, trusting. Had Robert known what Thomas would become? Had Robert seen the ruthlessness that Thomas possessed and encouraged it? Or had Thomas already been ruthless, and Robert had simply recognized a kindred spirit? By the time morning came, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My body was exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. I showered and dressed and drove to the restaurant to meet Thomas. It was a clear fall day, the kind that makes you aware of the transience of all seasons, all beauty, all arrangements. Thomas was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking like he'd stepped out of a GQ editorial. At 58, he was one of those men who'd found a way to make aging look like a strategic choice. His hair had gone silver. His face had developed character lines. His whole presentation suggested a man who'd earned his authority through competence rather than mere youthful ambition. "Harrison," he said, standing up to shake my hand. The gesture was warm, practiced, full of a kind of performance that I was suddenly aware I was meant to believe. "Good to see you. You look tired." "Long nights," I said. We ordered lunch. Thomas got a salad. I got pasta, something I would barely touch. We made small talk about the business, about recent projects, about a client that had been in the news. Thomas talked about his kids. He had 3, all of them successful. All of them living on the coasts where the money was better and the opportunities greater. One of his sons worked in venture capital in Silicon Valley. One of his daughters was a lawyer in New York. The youngest worked in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles. All of this was, of course, something to be proud of, and Thomas mentioned each achievement with the casual pride of someone secure in the fact that his children had exceeded him. When the food arrived, Thomas waited until we were both positioned with our meals before he got to the actual point of the meeting. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "The board is very focused on efficiency metrics right now. There's been a lot of pressure about our overhead costs. And when that happens, management has to look at every position and ask whether it's really adding value." "My position?" I said. "All positions, but yes, including yours. Look, I'm going to be direct. You've been with the company for a long time, and I respect that. I respect your work. But the world has changed. The kind of consulting we do now is very different from what we did in 1997. It's faster. It's more specialized. It requires people who are on the cutting edge of methodology, who can speak to emerging technologies, who can ... double quotes he trailed off, and I filled in the blank for him. "Young," I said. "That's not what I said." "No, but it's what you meant." Thomas set down his fork. His face did something complicated. For a moment, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like respect for me saying the quiet part out loud. "Okay," he said. "In large part, yes. There's a premium being placed on youth, on energy, on the ability to absorb new frameworks quickly. That's just the reality of the consulting industry right now. So what's the proposal?" I asked. "Severance package?" "There will be a generous severance, yes, if we go in that direction. We're not there yet. The board wants me to explore options. Whether that means a role change, a position in a different part of the company, or a clean exit, that's still to be determined. But I wanted you to know what's being considered so that you could start thinking about your own preferences. Start thinking about your own preferences. As if I had preferences. as if I had anything other than the preference to not lose my income and my health insurance at 52 years old. I took a bite of pasta I didn't taste. I appreciate you being honest, I said, and meant it, though not in the way he probably thought I meant it. I want you to know this isn't personal, Harrison. You're a good man. I've always thought that. But we're in a business that doesn't always have room for good men. And there it was, the thing I'd been waiting to hear. The hint of something darker beneath the surface of corporate life. The acknowledgement that sometimes being good wasn't enough, sometimes it was actually a disadvantage. I wondered, very clearly in that moment, if Thomas was thinking about Robert Chun. If Robert had also been too good, too trustworthy, too much of an obstacle to Thomas's ambitions. What happened between you and Robert Chun? I asked. It came out of nowhere. It wasn't planned. It was the kind of thing that you only say when you've stopped caring about consequences. Thomas's hand froze halfway to his water glass. His expression didn't change, but I saw something flash through his eyes. Recognition. Awareness that something had shifted in the conversation. That was a long time ago, he said carefully. What was? Your friendship? Your business relationship? Both. He set his glass down very deliberately. Robert was a mentor to me early in my career. He was a generous man. He gave me opportunities. And then he died. In a car accident. Yes, that was tragic. I found a photograph, I said. I had no plan for saying this, no strategy, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. You and Robert. From 1994, before he took me under his wing, before he became my mentor. Thomas looked at me directly. His eyes were very steady. I didn't know you were that bothered by Robert taking you on as a protege, he said slowly. I'm not. That's not what this is about, isn't it? I've always sensed over the years that you wondered why Robert chose to invest in me the way he did. Why I ended up in senior management and you didn't. The pasta turned to something heavy and unpleasant in my mouth. That's not what I'm asking you. But it's what you're really asking, isn't it? You want to know what I have that you don't. You want to know why I succeeded and you stayed in the middle. And the truth, Harrison, is that it's not actually complicated. I was hungry. I wanted it more. I was willing to do the things that had to be done. Robert recognized that. He valued that. And you're good. You're capable. But you were never hungry enough. I didn't respond for a moment. We just sat there, two men in a restaurant, suspended in a moment that felt very significant, though I couldn't quite articulate why. Around us, other business people were having their own meetings, their own conversations, all of it part of the same elaborate system of advancement and displacement, of success and failure, of the people who rose and the people who stayed in place. Was it an accident? I asked. Robert's death. Thomas looked puzzled. His car accident? Of course it was an accident. What else would it be? I don't know, I said. You tell me. He set down his napkin. I think this conversation is over, he said quietly. When you're ready to discuss your employment situation rationally, you let me know. But I'm not going to sit here and have you accuse me of whatever it is you're trying to accuse me of. He stood up. He pulled out his wallet and placed some cash on the table. Get yourself together, Harrison. Talk to HR. Think about what you want your next chapter to be. But stop digging into the past. It's not healthy. And it's not going to change anything. He left. I sat there and finished my pasta, which had gone cold and congealed in a way that made it barely edible. Around me, the restaurant continued its normal operations. Servers brought plates. People laughed. The illusion of ordinary life proceeded without interruption. The drive back to my house took 40 minutes. I had a lot of time to think about what had just happened. Thomas hadn't answered my question. He deflected, which was interesting, but he hadn't actually denied anything. And the warning he'd given me to stop digging, that seemed like something that a guilty person would say, or at least something a person with secrets would say. But I was smart enough to understand that absence of guilt was not the same as absence of secrets. I spent the rest of the week being very careful. I didn't contact Thomas. I didn't reach out to HR. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking or what I'd been researching. What I did was I accessed the company's archives more carefully. I pulled old reports. I searched for mentions of Robert in company communications. I looked at the sequence of his promotions, the trajectory of his career, and I tried to map it against what I knew about the business. What I found was that Robert had been positioned to take over for the then CEO in 2004. He was supposed to be promoted. He'd been groomed for that position. And then he died in 2003, right before the promotion could happen. And Thomas, mysteriously, had moved up. Not all the way to CEO. That position had gone to an external hire, but far enough. A promotion that, in the ordinary course of events, Robert's death had made possible. I told none of this to anyone. But I knew in the way that you know certain truths that can't be proven, that exist in a space between evidence and intuition. I knew that something had happened. Some 25-year-old conspiracy that had shaped the company I'd been part of, that had shaped my own career, my own path, my own understanding of how the world worked, and knowing it changed me. I could feel the change occurring daily. I would wake up in the morning and spend the first few minutes just accepting the fact of it. I knew something now. I knew that the world operated under different rules than I'd been assuming. I knew that success in this world sometimes required a willingness to do things that shouldn't be done. I knew that my goodness, my steadiness, my reliability were not virtues in a system that rewarded ruthlessness. Rebecca reached out to me on a Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after my lunch with Thomas. She sent me an instant message asking if I wanted to grab coffee, if I was around. I was intrigued by this. Rebecca had never sought out my company before, though we'd been polite to each other in meetings, had nodded in hallways, had maintained the kind of professional distance that made sense given the generational gap between us. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the office. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table in the back, looking nervous in a way that I found oddly touching. She was probably 32, maybe 33, with the kind of energy that comes from being on the ascending side of a career trajectory. But there was something in her expression that suggested doubt, or at least the beginning of doubt. "Thanks for meeting me," she said after I'd sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Because I'm going to be honest with you in a way that probably isn't in my best interest." "Okay," I said. "I'm listening." "Thomas asked me to take the project from you," she said. "But it wasn't framed like that. It was framed like an opportunity for me, like he was giving me responsibility. And I believed that, at first. But then I started noticing things. The way he positioned what I was doing, how he talked about my work versus how he talked about other people's work. And I realized that what I was actually part of was you being pushed out." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have a father," she said, "and he's about your age. And he worked at a corporation for 30 years, just like you. And they did the same thing to him, and he didn't see it coming. He thought he was secure. He thought his work spoke for itself. And then one day he was gone, and he spent the next 2 years trying to figure out what had happened, what he'd done wrong, what he could have done differently. He's recovered, mostly. He has a consulting practice now, but he lost a lot of years to shame and confusion. And watching what's happening to you, I just kept thinking about him. I didn't know what to say to this. Rebecca was offering me something that I hadn't known I needed. She was offering me validation that what I was experiencing wasn't just in my head, that my intuition about what was happening was correct. She was offering me evidence that I wasn't crazy. "Does Thomas know that you're talking to me?" I asked. "No. And if he found out, it would be bad for me professionally. So I'm asking you to be careful with this information. I'm not trying to sabotage Thomas or the company. I'm just trying to do the right thing by you." "Why do you care?" I asked. "You're positioned really well. You're young, ambitious, talented. You're going to do great things in this business. Why would you risk that? Rebecca looked at me for a long moment. Because I don't want to be the kind of person who sees something wrong and does nothing about it. Because I've watched my father spend his 60s trying to rebuild a life after losing everything he worked for. And I don't want that to be how the world works. I know that's naive. I know that's not how the business world actually operates. But that's what I want anyway. After Rebecca left, I sat in that coffee shop for a long time, just thinking. She'd given me something that Thomas had taken away. She'd given me back my narrative. She'd confirmed that my understanding of what was happening wasn't paranoia or jealousy or the kind of manufactured grievance that bitter, middle-aged men created to justify their own failure. What was happening to me was real. It was systematic. It was being done deliberately, with specific intent, as part of a larger pattern. The question now was what I was going to do about it. I'd spent most of my career doing what I was told. I'd been a good employee. I'd shown up. I'd done my work. I'd collaborated. I'd been a team player. And all of that had gotten me nowhere particular. I was 52 years old, and I was being pushed out of the only career I'd ever had. I went home and I opened my laptop and I started researching employment lawyers. I didn't know if I actually had a case against the company. I didn't know if an age discrimination claim would go anywhere. But I knew that I needed to understand my options. I needed to know what rights I had. I needed to know if the rules that govern the world that I'd been living in actually existed, or if they were just stories we told ourselves to explain away injustice. The lawyer I eventually met with was a woman named Sandra Okonkwo, and she worked for a firm that specialized in employment law. Her office was in a building on the north side of the city, far from the financial district where Rothstein and Associates operated. She was probably my age, maybe a few years younger, with silver streaking through her hair and the kind of focused intensity that comes from having seen a lot of injustice and decided to do something about it. I told her the whole story. I told her about being moved to a nebulous strategic oversight role. I told her about being excluded from meetings. I told her about Rebecca approaching me, about Thomas's conversation with me, about the whole trajectory of dismissal that had been occurring for months. She listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression careful and neutral. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. "This is harassment," she said. "What you're describing is constructive dismissal. The company is creating an environment where continued employment is untenable, with the specific intent of forcing you to quit. It's illegal under federal age discrimination statutes. The question is whether you want to pursue it." "What would pursuing it involve?" I asked. "Litigation. We'd file a complaint with the EEOC. There would be discovery. There would be depositions. There would be attempts at settlement. It would take time. It would be stressful. And it's likely that, win or lose, you're never going to work in consulting again. Your industry is small. Word gets out. Companies don't hire people who sue them. So what's my alternative? Severance negotiation. We could approach their legal team, present what you're entitled to, and try to work out a package that makes it worth your while to leave quietly. If the company is worried about litigation, they might be generous. If they're not worried, they'll lowball you. But at minimum, you'd walk away with something." I sat with this for a moment. The consulting industry was all I knew. A severance package would tide me over for maybe a year, maybe 18 months if I was careful. And then what? I'd be 53 years old, with no job, with age and lack of current experience working against me, trying to figure out how to rebuild something from nothing. "I need to think about it," I said. "Think quickly," Sandra said. "Once they know you're aware of what they're doing, the timeline accelerates. They'll want to get you out before you can do any damage." I left her office with a folder full of information about my rights, about precedents, about the various ways that age discrimination cases could play out. I read all of it carefully. I started documenting everything at work. I printed out emails. I kept a log of meetings I wasn't invited to. I was building a case, even though I hadn't decided whether I would use it. The next week, I received a formal email from HR. They were offering me the chance to participate in a voluntary career transition program. The language was so carefully constructed, so deliberately vague, that it took me a moment to understand what they were actually offering. If I accepted, I would receive 12 months of severance, plus extended health insurance for another 6 months, plus my accumulated vacation payout. In exchange, I would sign an agreement promising not to sue the company, not to badmouth them, not to discuss the terms of my departure with anyone. The offer was sitting on my desk, requiring a response by the end of the week. I read it multiple times. On one level, it was generous. On another level, it was an insult, a way of saying, we're going to pay you to go away, and in exchange, you're going to agree that nothing wrong happened here. I called Sandra. They've made an offer, I said. How much? She asked. I told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. It's decent, she said. It's not great, but it's not contemptible either. They're acknowledging that they're uncomfortable about something, even if they won't admit what that something is. What should I do? I asked. That's up to you. But I'll tell you what I've seen happen. I've seen guys take severance packages and feel immediately relieved for about a week. Then the reality of being unemployed sets in, and they regret it. They want to fight. But they've already signed away their right to do so. So think carefully about which kind of outcome you can live with. Fighting and losing. Fighting and winning. Or walking away with enough money to survive the transition. I had 4 days to make a decision. I spent them in a state of analysis that probably wasn't healthy. I made spreadsheets. I calculated how long I could survive on the severance. I looked at my retirement accounts. I thought about the mortgage. I thought about my kids, about whether they'd understand my decision, whatever it was. I thought about what it meant to have built a career in a place that had been, all along, a place designed to discard me. On the 4th day, I called Thomas directly. I said I wanted to meet. He seemed wary, but he agreed. We met at his office instead of at a restaurant, and I appreciated that. It meant this was business rather than theater. I got the career transition offer, I said without preamble. I hope you'll consider it seriously, he said. It's a fair package. I want to know about Robert Chun, I said. I want to know what happened between you two. And I want to know if there's any connection between his death and the trajectory of your career. Thomas's expression didn't change, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly. If you're asking what I think you're asking, the answer is no. Robert died in a car accident. That's the official story, and that's the true story. Was there an investigation? I asked. There was a police report filed. It was ruled accidental. But did you know him to be someone who might have been targeted? Was there any reason to suspect? No, Thomas said firmly. And I'm not going to sit here and listen to conspiracy theories about Robert's death. You're dealing with a lot right now, Harrison. Your career is ending. That's difficult. That makes people irrational. But I'm telling you as someone who values you, don't go down this road. Sign the severance agreement. Take the money. Go build a new life. Don't spend the next decade nursing a grudge about something that happened 25 years ago. You're frightened, I said. It wasn't a question. I'm not frightened. I'm concerned about you. You're frightened that I know something, or that I might find out something, or that I might tell someone something. That's why you're being so generous with the severance package. That's why you're not fighting me. You want me to go away quietly. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He studied me for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. I'm going to tell you something, but I'm going to tell you it as someone who has always respected you. You're right. I don't want you to pursue whatever line of investigation you're on. I don't want you to talk to people about Robert. I don't want you to file complaints or lawsuits or make waves of any kind. And yes, the severance package is generous because I'm asking you to go away quietly. Is that a confession of guilt? Make of it what you want. Why? I asked. What are you protecting? I'm protecting people, Thomas said. People I care about. People who could be hurt by revelations that would satisfy your need for answers, but wouldn't actually change anything. Sometimes, Harrison, that's what wisdom looks like. Sometimes it means accepting that there are things you don't get to know, and that's okay. I left his office without taking the severance agreement. I went home and I sat in my house in the dark and I tried to figure out what Thomas had just told me. He'd confirmed, without confirming, that something was not as it seemed. He'd acknowledged that he had reasons to want me to stay quiet. He'd suggested that those reasons had to do with protecting people rather than protecting himself. That night I couldn't sleep. I went back into the research. I looked into Robert's family. He had a daughter, Margaret Chun, who was probably in her early 40s now. She'd been 20 when her father died. I found her on LinkedIn. She worked as a therapist in Portland. I found her phone number through a provider directory. I called her at 10 p.m. A woman answered, sounding wary. "Hello? My name is Harrison Blake," I said. "I'm sorry for calling so late. I worked with your father, Robert Chun, at Rothstein and Associates. He was my mentor early in my career, and I've been thinking about him recently, and I had some questions." There was a long pause. "Who did you say you are?" "Harrison Blake. I was at his funeral. It was a long time ago now." Another pause. "I remember you. You gave a speech. You talked about integrity. Your father valued integrity," I said. "I wanted to ask you something about his death." "Why are you calling me about my father's death?" The tone had shifted to something protective and something guarded. "Because I've been reading about it, and some things don't quite add up. I wanted to see if you had questions about it." "My father died in a car accident," Margaret said. Her voice was flat, final. "It was a long time ago. I've made peace with it. Did the police investigation ever feel complete to you?" I asked. "Did you ever have doubts about what happened?" "My father is gone," Margaret said. "What good does it do to have doubts 25 years later? Doubts don't bring people back. They just keep you trapped." "I understand," I said. "But if you ever wanted to talk about it—" "I don't," she said firmly. "I think you should let this go, Mr. Blake, for your own sake. Some things aren't meant to be understood." She hung up the phone. I sat there in the dark, holding the phone, realizing that everyone who might have known what happened had collectively decided to let it remain. Unknown, Thomas, Margaret, perhaps others. They'd all made a choice to keep this secret, and they'd done a good enough job that the truth had simply become unrecoverable. The next morning, I signed the severance agreement. I did it not because I'd given up on understanding what had happened to Robert, but because I'd understood something more important. The truth wasn't going to change my life. Knowing or not knowing wasn't going to give me back my career, wasn't going to resolve the injustice of age discrimination, wasn't going to make me young again or give me the kind of energy and ambition that the business world currently rewarded. What knowing would do was consume me. It would make me bitter. It would make me spend the remaining years of my life chasing ghosts instead of building something new. I left Rothstein and Associates on a Friday at the end of the quarter. They threw me a modest going-away lunch. Rebecca was there. So was Marcus, a colleague from my early years at the company who I'd stayed friendly with over the decades. Thomas came, briefly, to shake my hand. We both performed the role of professional cordiality. Two men who'd engaged in a negotiation and come to a mutual agreement. Walking out of the office for the last time, I felt something that surprised me. Relief. Not shame, not bitterness, not even anger. Just relief that it was over, that I didn't have to maintain the fiction anymore, that I could stop performing the role of the good employee who was becoming invisible. 3 months later, I'd found new work. It wasn't in consulting. It was in a smaller firm, a training company that helped corporations develop their employees. The pay was lower. The status was lower. The trajectory toward retirement was steeper. But there was something about it that felt true in a way that Rothstein had never felt, not even in the beginning. I spent some of that time thinking about what Thomas had said to me. He told me to stop digging, and I had stopped. But that didn't mean I'd forgotten. It didn't mean I'd accepted the official story. It meant I'd made a choice about what I was willing to spend my energy on. I was sitting in a coffee shop 6 months after leaving Rothstein on a Saturday afternoon when someone tapped me on the shoulder. It was Marcus. He had a newspaper with him, and he seemed nervous about something. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, sitting down across from me. The newspaper was open to a business section article. The headline read, "Rothstein and Associates Board initiates internal investigation into early 2000s leadership transition." I read the article carefully. It was sparse on details, but the basics were there. Someone had come forward with allegations about irregularities surrounding Robert Chun's promotion. There were suggestions that there might have been manipulation of the succession planning process. The board had hired an external firm to investigate. Thomas had recused himself from the investigation. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked Marcus. "I know that Margaret Chun reached out to the board," Marcus said. "She hired a lawyer. She was asking questions about her father's death. At first, no one wanted to listen. But apparently, she had documentation. Letters her father had written in the years before he died where he expressed concerns about Thomas actually. About Thomas's ambitions. About things Thomas had supposedly suggested to Robert that Robert wasn't comfortable with." "What kind of things?" I asked. "The article doesn't say. But Margaret has an attorney. They've been working on this for the better part of 6 months. Apparently, she decided that truth mattered more than peace." I read the article again. I looked at Margaret's name, which wasn't mentioned in the piece but which I knew was behind this action. She'd made a different choice than I had. She'd decided to pursue the questions rather than let them go. "Do you think anything will come of it?" I asked Marcus. "I think Thomas will walk away," Marcus said. "Rich, respected, not officially charged with anything, but his legacy will be different. The story will be different. That probably matters to someone." I thanked Marcus and went back to my coffee. I thought about Robert Chun, dead now for more than 2 decades, with a daughter who'd spent significant energy trying to find out what had happened to him. I thought about Thomas, who'd managed to build a successful career on the foundation of something he'd never fully acknowledged. I thought about myself, at 53 years old, starting over in a career that wasn't the one I'd expected. What I understood, sitting there in that coffee shop, was that the truth about Robert Chun might never fully come to light. There might never be a clear account of whether his death was an accident or something else, whether Thomas was guilty of complicity or merely guilty of opportunism. But the story was changing anyway. The narrative was being rewritten. And that was something. I spent the next 2 years in my new job rebuilding things. When rented out the house for a year, traveled, spent time in places I'd never been. I called my kids more often. I didn't always know what to say to them, but I showed up. I went to Michael's company events. I attended Emma's graduate school presentations. I started dating again, carefully, tentatively, someone who had no idea who I'd been before. And I didn't think about Thomas most days, but I thought about Robert sometimes. I thought about the man he'd been, the potential he'd had, the life that had been cut short. I thought about the fact that his death had changed all of our lives, mine, Thomas's, Margaret's, even though none of us had been conscious of just how much it was changing things at the time. 5 years after I left Rothstein and Associates, I was at a conference in Denver, and I ran into Rebecca Chen. She'd moved on from the company too, had taken a different path, was now working in a role that she'd built for herself rather than one that had been given to her. We had coffee and we caught up. She told me that the investigation into the early 2000s had eventually been quietly closed. Thomas had voluntarily stepped down from his position, citing a desire to spend more time with family. He'd received a generous pension. He was living somewhere in the Southwest, playing golf, and as far as Rebecca knew, was quite happy. "Do you know what they concluded?" I asked. "About Robert?" "Not officially," Rebecca said, "but there were implications. Accusations that Thomas had interfered with the succession planning process, that Robert's death had been conveniently timed, but nothing provable. Nothing that would stand up in court. Margaret got to tell her story, and the board heard it, and that seemed to be enough for her. I nodded. I understood something about that. Sometimes, what matters isn't whether you can prove something in a court of law. What matters is whether you get to tell your story, whether someone is willing to listen, whether your version of events gets to exist in the world as a counter-narrative to the official one. I'm 58 now. The house is paid off. My retirement accounts are modest but adequate. I'm still working, but I've reduced my hours. I travel a fair amount. I've built a reasonably comfortable life out of the pieces that were left after the structure of my old career collapsed. I don't regret leaving Rothstein. I don't regret signing away my right to sue them. I do regret the time I spent trying to understand what had happened, the months I lost to investigation and obsession. But I also understand why I spent that time. It mattered, at least to me, to know that I wasn't crazy, that the systems I'd been part of were sometimes corrupt, that my intuition about what was happening to me was correct. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone to the authorities instead of accepting severance. If I'd been willing to pursue legal action. If I'd been willing to blow up my life in service of proving a point that probably wouldn't have been provable anyway. But those questions are academic now. The choices are made. The story is over, or at least the active part of it is. What remains is the knowledge that people are more complicated than their roles, that systems are often corrupt in ways that can't be easily detected or remedied, that sometimes the truth is less important than moving forward, that sometimes the best you can do is survive and perhaps, in surviving, maintain a bit of your integrity. Thomas Chun was ruthless. Robert Chun is dead. And I'm here, still alive, still wondering about the things I'll never fully know. Still trying to figure out what it means to be a good person in a world that doesn't particularly value goodness.